Well, welcome everyone to Eschatology with Pastor Eric. Today we're going to be doing part 2 in examining the Prewrath Rapture. We're going to begin answering the question, is it biblical? Now, if you recall, last time we did address the Prewrath Rapture and showed that there are serious problems with the view. And as I say that, I want to remind everyone that those who are premillennial, I have a huge affinity towards, because I believe the millennial issue is really the key issue in eschatology. And so I want to start off by saying I have many friends in the pre-wrath movement. I think they're wonderful students of the scriptures, and we agree on 99% of eschatology. We are all premillennial, which is huge. We believe that rapture happens prior to the wrath, and so those who are pre-wrath take the promises of God seriously, that the church will be removed prior to God's wrath being poured out. And those who hold to the pre-wrath view have a very high view of predictive prophecy. In other words, they don't spiritualize texts that should just be taken in a normal sense that the author intended. Now, saying that, again, I'm not a postmodern. I do believe that the data is clear as to when the rapture occurs. I am pre-trib. And so I want to show you, in my opinion, what are the big three problems with the pre-wrath view. The first one is that the pre-wrath view claims that the 70th week of Daniel is cut short to be less than the full 7 years. And if you recall, specifically, I said they believe that the last 3.5 years is going to be cut short by the rapture or the day of the Lord. Remember, the rapture is the beginning of the day of the Lord. And so they believe that that's going to happen sometime in the last 3.5 years. And so the last 3.5 years will not really be 3.5 years. Therefore, the whole 70th week, the last 7 years, won't be a full 7 years. Okay, now, last time I showed the problem with that is there clear text in the book of Revelation, which was written after Matthew 24:21 through 22 was written. Remember, Matthew 24:21 through 22 is where we see that those days be cut short. Remember, Jesus says, unless those days be cut short, no flesh would survive. I, as a pre-trib proponent, say, well, that means the 70th week of Daniel was ordained not to be any longer than that. The pre-wrath side says, no, it means the 70th week of Daniel is going to be less than that. And specifically, they say the last 3.5 years will not really be 3.5 years of tribulation. It'll be cut short by the rapture of the church. That's what they're claiming. The problem with that is Revelation 13:5 says that the Antichrist reigns for 42 months, which is 3.5 years. Well, how is that possible if Christ is in fact raptured the church and begun the day of the Lord? Okay, what I'm claiming is therefore you would have a problem that sometime in the last 3.5 years the Antichrist work is not being disrupted by the return of Christ. Okay, so that was a big problem, I think, with the pre-wrath view. Now, let me go into a couple more. Today, we're going to be addressing this one. Pre-wrath claims the Great Tribulation is cut short by the day of the Lord. The problem with that is the worst time period ever then is being cut short by an even worse time period. Jesus is very clear in Matthew 24:21 that the Great Tribulation that begins in the 3.5-year mark is the worst time period ever. He says, upon the world will come such days such as never occurred nor ever will. Okay, what he means by that is it's the worst ever. The problem with the pre-wrath view is they cut short the Great Tribulation, which is the worst time period ever, with the day of the Lord, which is the worst time period ever. Well, now all of a sudden you have two worst time periods. You have the worst time period being cut short by an even worse time period. So, as I like to say in my eschatology messages, you can't have the worstest. And so what that shows us is it's very unlikely that in fact you have a cutting short of this last 3.5 years by the day of the Lord. As a pre-trib proponent, I believe the day of the Lord begins at the inception of the 70th week. And therefore the Great Tribulation is part and parcel with the day of the Lord. And therefore the day of the Lord contains the worst time period ever. It doesn't stop the worst time period ever with something even worse. That to me is a contradiction I don't think pre-wrath can get around. The third issue that we'll be coming to next time is pre-wrath claims that God's wrath is not present in the first 6 seals. And I'll be proving to you, I think, biblically, that that's not likely. In light of the fact that the day of the Lord comes while they're saying peace and safety, and sudden destruction comes upon them, we know that peace and safety is removed at the beginning of the 70th week. Why? Because at the second seal, I'll try to get that in the picture, at the second seal, the text in Revelation 6 is very clear that peace is removed from the earth. Okay, well, you can't be saying peace and safety when you have no peace and safety. And what that shows is the day of the Lord begins with God's wrath at the inception of the 70th week of Daniel. Okay, so we're going to focus, though, today on number 2. Is it likely, or is it even possible, that the worst time period ever can be cut short by an even worse time period? And I'm going to show you that that's a contradiction. Now, what am I wrestling with? Well, I'm wrestling with this text. And so we in the pre-trib position and the pre-wrath position are going to disagree as to how to interpret this. Now, remember, Matthew 24, 21 through 22, Jesus had already talked about the abomination that causes desolation in Matthew 24, 15, just some 6 verses earlier. Well, that's right here. So he's focusing on the last 3.5 years known as the Great Tribulation. And so what he says, for then there will be a great tribulation such as not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. Now stop there. I think it's a fair reading, and let me just ask you, the audience, do you think it's a fair reading in verse 21 that Jesus is describing the worst time period ever? Now, why do I summarize it as the worst time period ever? Well, because he says there will be great tribulation such has not occurred since the beginning of the world. In other words, never in the past has it been this bad until now. This is the time when it occurs, nor ever will. So Jesus is clearly saying it will never have been that bad in the past, nor will it ever be that bad again in the future. All right. Now, in verse 22, remember, this is where pre-wrath gets this idea that the last 3.5 years are going to be less than 3.5 years. I don't believe that. Again, Antichrist, according to Revelation 13:5, reigns for 3.5 years. But they get it from this phrase where it says, unless those days had been cut short. I'm assuming they're cut short to 3.5 years or 7 total. The pre-wrath says, no, it's less than that. Notice Jesus says, if they weren't cut short, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Now, for our purposes today, we're going to focus on verse 21. Is it true that the Great Tribulation period is the worst time period ever? I think it is. I think that's an established fact from Scripture. The Great Tribulation is the worst time period ever. It has never been that bad in the past, and it never will be that bad in the future. It's the worst time period ever. Now again, when does the Great Tribulation start? Well, it starts with the Antichrist setting himself up in the temple, declaring himself to be God, committing what is referred to as the abomination that causes desolation. Now, Jesus refers to that in Matthew 24:15. Again, that's just 6 verses prior to this. So he's clearly talking about this time period. Why is that important? Because many people in the church today, and by the way, there are many people, more people on my side, that get this wrong than on any other side. They'll say, well, Jesus is referring to things in the church age. That's not true. That is not true. That leads to sensationalism, where you open up your newspaper and you say, well, I saw wars and rumors of wars. These are things happening in the church age. No, the wars and rumors of wars Jesus refers to in Matthew 24 are so bad that you lose 1/4 of the earth's population. Those are the opening wars in the 70th week of Daniel. Okay, so the Great Tribulation is the worst time period ever. When does it begin? Well, it begins at the 3.5 year mark. All right, Jesus says, notice the Great Tribulation, it's the worst ever. That's a fact. Now, the pre-wrath assertion is that the Great Tribulation will be cut short by the day of the Lord. Let's put that up. They believe the day of the Lord will come and cut short the Great Tribulation. Now, what's the big problem with that? Well, the day of the Lord is the worst time period ever. Do you see the contradiction? Now you have the worst time period ever being cut short by something that's even worse. So all of a sudden now you have the worstest. You cannot have 2 of the worst time periods ever. One is going to cease to being the worst. Okay, you can only have one worst time period. The day of the Lord is depicted in Scripture as the worst ever. But they're cutting short the worst ever with it. Whereas in the pre-tribulational view, the view that I hold to, is that the day of the Lord begins at the inception of the 70th week. Therefore, the Great Tribulation is just part of the day of the Lord. And so, of course, the day of the Lord and the Great Tribulation then are the worst time period ever. And you don't have the worst time period ever being cut short by something that's the worst time period ever. That's an absurdity. Okay, let's just talk about the law of non-contradiction. The law of non-contradiction says if A, then not non-A at the same time and in the same relationship. So if you have the worst time period ever, you can't have the non-worst time period ever at the same time in the same relationship. Why do I say that? Because the day of the Lord is the worst time period ever. So you can only have one worst time period. That is, to me, an irreconcilable contradiction of the pre-wrath movement. Okay, and again, another reason why I, in good conscience, could never hold to the view, even though I have wonderful friends who are great Bible students in their own right who do hold to it. Okay, so let's keep asking ourselves the question, can the worst time period ever be cut short by something worse? One of the reasons I put Jeremiah 30 verse 7 up here is to refer to this last 3.5 years known as Jacob's distress. Notice how Jeremiah describes it. He says, for that day is great. By the way, he's referring to the day of the Lord. Why? Because in the pre-trib rapture view, the day of the Lord begins here, and it ensues, really, the broad day of the Lord all the way to eternity. So the Great Tribulation is a period within the day of the Lord. So notice he's referring to the day of the Lord, specifically this period with the last 3.5 years, and he says there is none like it. Why? Why does Jeremiah say it? Well, because Jesus says the same thing, and what I'm pointing out is it's the inerrant word of God. They're not contradicting one another. Jesus says it's the worst time period ever. So Jeremiah and Jesus are in agreement that this time period is the worst time period ever, that is the Great Tribulation, and it is inside the day of the Lord. Notice it's a time of Jacob's distress, but he will be saved from it. Okay, so let's keep asking ourselves, can the worst time period ever be cut short by something even worse? What I want to prove to you is that indeed the pre-wrath proponents believe that the Great Tribulation, the worst time period ever, will be cut short by the day of the Lord, which is the worst time period ever. And I'll give you a couple of scholars. By the way, I have a lot of respect for these men. Again, we agree on 99% of things, and it almost pains me to disagree with them because I like them so much. But let me just show you, for example, Charles Cooper. Like him a lot. He gets a lot right. But listen to what he says. He says, let me state what is true about Matthew 24. The imminent inception of the day of the Lord begins at Matthew 29. Everything before Matthew 24:29, i.e., Matthew 24 verses 3 through 28, describes Satan and his antichrist persecution of God's elect. So notice what Charles Cooper, this pre-wrath proponent, is claiming is the day of the Lord in the Olivet Discourse does not happen until Matthew 24:29. Well, if you recall in the previous slide, I just read to you about the Great Tribulation that occurs in Matthew 24:21. Okay, so notice he is saying, well, no, the day of the Lord does not happen at the Great Tribulation or during the Great Tribulation. It's going to occur after. The problem? Well, Jesus says the Great Tribulation in Matthew 24:21 is the worst time period ever. Well, Charles Cooper, pre-wrath proponent, has Matthew 24:29 coming after that, which is the beginning of the day of the Lord. So the day of the Lord, which is the worst time period ever then in his view, is cutting short the Great Tribulation, which is the worst time period ever. Do you see the problem? And the reason I'm laboring these various scholars of the pre-wrath position is to show you that I'm not making their position up. I don't want to ever misrepresent my opponent's position. Okay, and by the way, if there's some pre-wrath proponent out there, if you think I'm misrepresenting it, please correct me, because I don't want to get this wrong. But of all my research over the years, I think this is correct. Let me show you another scholar that I have a lot of respect for. In fact, I want to buy his book. He's a very staunch premillennialist, which I have tons of respect for. I want to put him up here, and that is Alan Kirshner. Notice what he says. He says, that is because the Great Tribulation, remember beginning at the 3.5-year mark, is not God's wrath. Okay, now I'm going to take issue with that next week, or next message that I'm going to be putting up. But notice he says the first 6 seals picture the sinful depravity of humanity that accumulate guilt before God, while the trumpets and bowls are God's consequent judgment against that guilt. What I'll prove to you is no, the day of the Lord's wrath is associated with the beginning of the opening of the seals. Why? Well, for example, again, at the 2nd seal, you have peace removed from the earth. The day of the Lord comes while they're saying peace and safety, then sudden destruction comes upon them. Well, sudden destruction is linked to the beginning of the 70th week because the warfare begins at the beginning. In fact, so bad is the warfare at the 4th seal, you lose 1/4 of the earth's population. Do not be deceived into thinking that God does not use human agency as instruments of his wrath. He did so, for example, in Isaiah 10, when he used the Assyrians as instruments of his wrath. You can read about that in Isaiah 10:9. We'll read about it in Revelation chapter 17, when all the nations give their allegiance to the beast for the sake of God's purposes. God uses the enemies of God, his own enemies, and the nations as his instruments of wrath. And he's doing it right from the beginning. What I want to show you here is that clearly Alan Kirshner does not believe that the Great Tribulation is part of the day of the Lord. Why? Well, because he believes that the rapture occurs sometime in the last 3.5 years. In fact, he goes on to say this. He says, the day of the Lord is not a mere literal 24-hour day, and I agree with him there. It is the unified, complex whole of events, starting with the deliverance of the saints and followed by an undetermined period of judgment. I completely agree with him. This will be followed by the salvation of Israel and the establishment of Jesus' earthly kingdom. In 1 Thessalonians 5, 1-11, Paul teaches that the last generation of the church will exist up to the first day of the Lord. On the first day, the Lord will deliver the church via the rapture from the ensuing day of the Lord's wrath. Now, stop there. What's he saying? Well, he believes this happens in the last 3.5 years, and so the Great Tribulation will be cut short by the rapture. Again, the problem is he is pointing out that the rapture, in his view, begins the day of the Lord. I believe the same thing, but I believe the rapture occurs here, and therefore the day of the Lord begins here. Therefore, because I believe this, I am not cutting short the Great Tribulation, which is the worst time period ever, with something that's even worse. You see, that's the problem with the pre-wrath view, is they're cutting short the Great Tribulation, the worst time period ever, according to Jesus himself in Matthew 24:21, with something that's even worse. So now you have the worst ever cut short by the worst ever. Do you see the contradiction? And again, I'm just trying to show you in their own words their view, so you don't think, well, Eric, you're just making up the pre-wrath view. No, I'm not. I'm just showing you what they actually believe. And again, these are men I have a lot of respect for. I want to get Alan Kirshner's next book. It's on really proving that Israel still has a place. It's a premillennial book. We agree on 99% of things, but to me, this is a contradiction. I just don't see how it can be resolved. Okay, now let me show you why the day of the Lord should be regarded as the worst time period ever. And again, the reason I think that's important is if the day of the Lord is proven to be the worst time period ever, and we know that the Great Tribulation is the worst time period ever, then they have to coincide. They have to go hand in hand, as the pre-trib position maintains. See, in the pre-trib position, the Great Tribulation, the worst time period ever, is part of the day of the Lord, which is the worst time period ever. In the pre-wrath position, it's being cut short by the worst time period ever. So is the day of the Lord, the future day of the Lord, the worst time period ever? Yes, listen to what Isaiah says. Isaiah 13, 8-10. Listen to what by the way, he's describing here the future day of the Lord. I believe Isaiah 13, 1-16 is describing the future day of the Lord. So if you and I are living sometime in this church age, he's describing this period still in our future. When you get to verse 17 all the way through verse 22 of Isaiah 13, Isaiah begins to describe the near term that is near term in his day, judgment of Babylon. So that would be prior to the cross at the hands of the Medo-Persians around 539 BC. Okay, now why would Isaiah write like that? Well, what I believe Isaiah does and many of the prophets is they talk about this future day of the Lord, and they blend it with what we would refer to as a near-term day of the Lord, or a better way is a foreshadowing of the day of the Lord, in the sense that it's as if they're saying, hey, let me show you a down payment that's going to be in the near term, the destruction of Babylon by the Medo-Persians, Isaiah 13, verses 17 through 22, to prove that God is good for the far-term day of the Lord in the future. That's how I think Isaiah is structuring it. And someday I'll do some exegetical work with you in Isaiah in many of the verses to show that indeed that's how the prophets understood it. The near proved that what God would do in the far. If God was faithful to judge the enemies in the near term, he's going to be faithful to do it in the far term. So my point in saying that is Isaiah 13, 8 through 10 is all about this future day of the Lord. In fact, a lot of the language is taken up by Jesus. For example, the anguish, or that the pains and anguish here that you refer to are the labor pains Jesus refers to in Matthew 24:8, the beginning of labor pains. Okay, so notice Isaiah 13, 8 through 10, he says, they will be terrified. These are the inhabitants of the earth during this time period. Pains and anguish, these are the labor pains, Odin in the Greek, the Septuagint. That's what Jesus uses to describe the beginning of the 70th week of Daniel. Pains and anguish will take hold of them. They will writhe like a woman in labor. They will look at one another in astonishment, their faces aflame. Behold, the day of the Lord is coming. This is the day of the Lord, cruel, with fury and burning anger, to make the land a desolation. And he will exterminate its sinners from it. For the stars of heaven and their constellations will not flash forth their light. The sun will be dark when it rises, and the moon will not shed its light. I want you to see that this is being described, the event described here is the day of the Lord. And notice he's going to exterminate sinners from what? From the land. Now the term here for land, haaretz, it's simply the land. And in context, it could mean either just the land of Israel or the land of the Babylonians, or it could mean the world. What seems to be described here is a worldwide judgment. And one of the evidences of that is just a verse later. I couldn't fit it all on the screen. But when you come to Isaiah 13:11, he talks about the whole inhabited world. He uses the term in Hebrew, tavel. So many scholars like J.L. Matyer, the great scholar of Isaiah, I think he's a British scholar, he would declare that indeed this is a worldwide judgment. Why? Because God is going to exterminate sinners from it. Now let's connect that to what Jesus said in Matthew 24:21. And 22. Do you remember in Matthew 24:21 through 22, Jesus said regarding this Great Tribulation, the last 3.5 years, he says, what will come upon the world will never have happened before, nor ever will. It'll be that bad. So it's the worst time period ever. That's Matthew 24:21. Then in verse 22, he says, unless those days be cut short, no flesh would survive. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Okay, why? Why does that tie into here? Because it says he will exterminate sinners from the land. Well, that's the day of the Lord. Okay, so what I'm showing you is that the day of the Lord is the worst time period ever. It'll exterminate sinners from the land. There'll never be a day like it. In other words, a time period like it. That's what's being described. So if the day of the Lord is in fact described as the worst time period ever, and yet that's cutting short in the Prewrath view, the Great Tribulation, which is the worst time period ever, again, you've got a contradiction. That's what I want you to see. Okay? How can you have the worst time period ever cutting short the worst time period ever? It doesn't make any sense. But if you're pre-trib, you believe that the day of the Lord begins at the inception of the 70th week. Therefore, the worst time period ever is part of the day of the Lord, which is the worst time period ever. They coincide, they go hand in hand. Why? Because they're one and the same. If you're pre-wrath, you have to have two worst time periods. To me, that's a big contradiction. Okay? Let me show you another passage and we'll close. I'm trying to keep my messages a little shorter so I don't blather on and on. Here's 1 Thessalonians 5, 2 through 3. We'll explore this more next time. But I want to wet your whistle with it. Notice here how Paul describes in the New Testament the day of the Lord. Notice he says, for you yourselves know full well that the day of the Lord will come just like a thief in the night. Now, what does he mean, just like a thief in the night? He means suddenly. The term that's used for thief there is kleptes. Remember, many of you have heard of the term in English, kleptomania. If you have someone who's a kleptomaniac, they can't stop stealing. They're addicted to it. Well, in the Greek, the kleptes is the one thief who would use stealth to get what he wants. There's another type of robber, a leistes. That would be a thief or a robber who uses force to get what he wants. Jesus could have used leistes to refer to the day of the Lord coming violently, but instead he uses kleptes to refer to it coming in a stealthy way, meaning there's no warning. Does a thief who comes by stealth give you warning prior? Well, of course not. So why is that important? Well, notice he continues. He says, while they're saying peace and safety, then destruction will come upon them suddenly. Like labor pains, remember Isaiah 13:8, that's taken right from there. Jesus uses the same term, odin, Matthew 24:8, the labor pains upon a woman with child, and they will not escape. Okay, now why is this such a big deal, this idea of it coming like a thief? It comes suddenly, and then the destruction comes suddenly upon them, because I believe that that shows us the day of the Lord must begin at the inception of the 70th week of Daniel. Why? Because even the pre-wrath proponents agree that at the fourth seal, when you lose a quarter of the earth's population due to sword, famine, pestilence, and wild beast, and by the way, that was called the wrath of God, according to Ezekiel 14:19 through 21, when it was poured upon the people of Israel and Judah. I don't know why it's not the wrath of God here, except for special pleading. We'll talk about that more. But I want you to think about it. The opening of the 70th week of Daniel, you have such destruction that certainly this must be referring to what? The day of the Lord. Because the day of the Lord comes while they're saying they have peace and safety, then destruction comes upon suddenly. In the pre-wrath view, the day of the Lord doesn't happen until here, sometime in the last 3.5 years. Well, could you say that that wrath is coming suddenly? No. You've already seen the worst warfare ever on the planet. You've seen the Antichrist set himself up in the temple. You've seen the worst time period ever. And yet all of a sudden now the day of the Lord comes? How is that coming suddenly? Well, no, of course it's not coming like a thief. You've been tipped off. You've had all these seal judgments that tipped you off to exactly what is going to happen in the future. So that's not coming suddenly. The day of the Lord comes suddenly. Okay? It reminds me, I don't know if anyone have seen the movie Fletch. I like comedy, and I apologize if there's some inappropriate parts in the movie, but there's a part where the main character, Chevy Chase, is trying to pretend to know someone to get information, and he's with a doctor, and he says, boy, he's sure a shame about Margaret. And that's what the doctor says to Chevy Chase, and Chevy Chase says, yeah, they died so suddenly. And the doctor says, what do you mean? They were in intensive care for weeks. And Chevy Chase says, well, yeah, but the very end, it was very sudden. And the point being is that you can't have something that's sudden that goes on for a long period of time, and it's an absurdity. In the same way, you can't have years of the worst wrath and destruction come upon the world and have it be sudden. That's one of the big problems with the pre-wrath view. When they say the day of the Lord happens in the last 3.5 years, how is that sudden? It's like saying someone dying for years all of a sudden died suddenly. Well, no, it wasn't sudden at all. All right? But here it would be sudden. Why? Because this is prior to the wrath being poured out, with the second seal, peace being taken from the earth. The fourth seal, you have sword, famine, pestilence, wild beasts killing a quarter of the earth. That would be coming upon the world suddenly. That's where the day of the Lord begins. If I'm right, then the Great Tribulation period, which is the worst time period ever, is part of the day of the Lord. And therefore it makes sense, because the day of the Lord is the worst time period ever, which contains the Great Tribulation, which is the worst time period ever. But if you're in the pre-wrath position, you have to cut short the worst time period ever with something that's even worse. That's a contradiction. That's a violation of the law of non-contradiction. You can't have the worst time period ever and not the worst time period ever at the same time and the same relationship. Dear brothers and sisters, the Lord calls us in Isaiah 1 to reason together. Let us reason. Can you have the worst time period ever be cut short by the worst time period ever? It doesn't make any sense. If it doesn't fit your data, get rid of it. Hold to a different view. That's what I'm laboring. And again, all the people in the pre-wrath view that I know, I love, adore, we agree on 99% of the things. But again, I have to show you why I don't believe the pre-wrath position is biblical and why I think the pre-tribulational view, again, shines in light of the data. Okay, well, with that, we'll catch you next time. We'll talk about more of the issues regarding the pre-wrath rapture and end times with Pastor Eric.